Déjà Vu revisited: Europe's endless quest for strategic autonomy, why the ghost of the European defense community still haunts Brussels. For more than 7 decades, Europe has lived under a strategic illusion that it could enjoy the benefits of sovereignty without bearing the costs of power. From the ruins of the Second World War to the present fractures within NATO, European leaders have repeatedly, repeatedly flirted with the idea of a unified defense architecture, only to recoil at the moment when political sacrifice becomes unavoidable. The European Defence Community (EDC), conceived in the early 1950s and buried in 1954, was the most ambitious and most honest attempt ever made to resolve Europe's military dilemma. Its failure was not accidental, it was structural, and its lessons remain dangerously unlearned. Today, as the United States reassesses its global priorities, Russia wages war on Europe's eastern flank and the Indo-Pacific draws American attention away from the Atlantic, Europe once again speaks the language of strategic autonomy. Yet the vocabulary has changed little since René Pleven stood before the French National Assembly in 1950. What has changed in the scale of Europe's dependence and the cost of its indecision? Europe after war. Security without sovereignty. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe faced a paradox that would define its post-world order. Militarily exhausted, economically shattered, and politically fragmented, Western Europe lacked both the capacity and the unity required to defend itself against a rapidly consolidating Soviet bloc. The creation of NATO in 1949 resolved the immediate problem: American power would guarantee European security. But the solution carried a hidden price. Strategic leadership shifted decisively to Washington. European defense planning, force posture, and escalation doctrine became subordinate to American priorities. What emerged was not an equal alliance but a hierarchical security arrangement, effective, stable, and deeply asymmetrical. By the early 1950s, the imbalance had been politically visible. The Berlin Crisis and the acceleration of decolonization, and above all, the outbreak of the Korean War, exposed Europe's strategic irrelevance in its own defense. The question was no longer whether Europe should rearm, but how, especially with regard to West Germany, whose rearmament was simultaneously necessary and politically explosive. From Churchill to Pleven, the birth of a radical idea. The first public articulation of a European defense concept came not from Paris or Brussels, but from London. In August 1950, Winston Churchill addressed the Council of Europe, proposed the creation of a European army that would integrate German forces under a supranational command, operating in cooperation with, but not absorbed by, the Atlantic Alliance. Churchill's proposal was cautious, Atlanticist, and strategic. Europe would gain capacity without undermining NATO. Rene Pleven's intervention 2 months later was bolder. On 24th of October 1950, Pleven presented to the French National Assembly a plan that went far beyond coordination or interoperability. The European Defence Community, as it would soon be known, proposed the creation of genuine supranational military structure. National armies would be integrated at the lowest operational level. Soldiers would serve under a European flag. Armament production, logistics, and command would be centralized. Political control would rest with the newly created European institutions. This was not merely defense cooperation, it was an attempt to transfer sovereignty itself. The architecture of the European Defense Council. Europe begins Europe before its time. The Treaty of Paris in 1952, which formalized the European Defense Council, outlined an institutional framework that strikingly resembles today's European Union. Decades before the EU acquired its modern form, a council of ministers would determine political direction, a common assembly would exercise oversight and budgetary control, a commissariat would function as an executive authority, a court of justice would ensure compliance with community law. Militarily, the plan was revolutionary. Units would be integrated at the platoon and company level, deliberately erasing national identity to prevent the re-emergence of independent national forces. Procurement and production would be regulated centrally. Research, including nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, would be coordinated at the European level. Even the possibility of a European nuclear deterrent, implicitly French-led, was open. No European defense initiative before or since has gone this far. The Atlantic Shadow, autonomy without independence. Yet the EDC contained a fatal contradiction. Despite its supranational ambitions, it explicitly reaffirmed subordination to NATO. Operational command of European forces would ultimately lie with NATO's Supreme Allied Command, SACEUR, secure, an American general. In effect, the EDC promised Europe political integration without strategic independence. The compromise was intended to reassure Washington and London. Instead, it alienated everyone else. To critics on the left, the EDC was a tool of American imperialism disguised as European unity. To critics on the right, it was a dangerous surrender of national sovereignty without real autonomy in return. The project asked Europeans to give up control without granting them command. The collapse. France says no. Between 1952 and 1954, parliamentary debates across the six signatory states revealed deeper ideological division, but also broad support. Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg ratified the treaty with strong majorities. Italy moved towards ratification. France did not. On August 30, 1954, the French National Assembly rejected the European Defence Council treaty. The vote brought together Gaullists, Communists, and Nationalists in a rare alliance of opposition. Beneath their differences lay a shared conclusion: the EDC demanded too much sovereignty while offering too little control. The French decision killed the project instantly. Italy withdrew its ratification bills months later. Europe's most ambitious defense experiment ended not with a bang but with a parliamentary vote. The pattern repeats from Cold War to today. The death of the EDC didn't end Europe's defense aspiration, it merely displaced them. Subsequent initiatives: the Fawcett Plan, Europe's political cooperation, and the Common Security and Defense Policy, PESCO, the European Defense Fund, have all sought to strengthen Europe's role without crossing the sovereignty threshold that doomed the EDC. The result had been a pattern of incrementalism without resolution. Europe has developed institutions without command, capabilities without cohesion, and strategies without enforcement. Defense cooperation exists, but only where it doesn't threaten national control. Integration advances, but stops short of hierarchy. This was not sustainable as long as American guarantees were unquestioned. That era is ending. Strategic autonomy and in an age of uncertainty. The contemporary geopolitical environment bears uncomfortable similarities to the early 1950s. The United States is increasingly focused on China. American domestic politics have introduced uncertainty into alliance commitments. Russia has demonstrated its willingness to use force on European borders. Meanwhile, Europe remains militarily fragmented, industrial constrained and politically divided. Once again, calls for a European army circulated through Brussels. Once again, leaders speak of autonomy, resilience, responsibility, and once again the fundamental question remains unanswered: who commands Europe and who obeys? The unlearned lesson. The European defense community failed not because it was unrealistic, but because it was too honest. It exposed us truth that European politics continues to evade. Defense is inseparable from sovereignty, and sovereignty is inseparable from hierarchy. A real European defense union requires one of the three outcomes: a dominant European power capable of leadership, a fully federal European state, continued dependence on an external guarantor. Europe has consistently rejected the first two while relying on the third. Until the choice is confronted directly, every new defense initiative will remain a variation on the same time. A careful dance around the ghost of the EDC, endlessly invoked, never embraced. History doesn't repeat itself because readers forget the past, it repeats because they refuse its conclusions.